Hi, I'm Carol Brull. I'm at the Spruill Center for the Arts, and I want to show you a few projects today that could be done in a very short period of time. Sometimes people are just plain impatient or they don't have very much time, so I'm going to do some projects that all will take 5 minutes or less. So when I was planning on the different kind of projects I could do in 5 minutes or less, I decided to sketch them in clay. So if you just take a little piece of clay, roll it out thin, and then just play around with it, you can get some ideas as to what something will do when it's bigger. And they took maybe 10-15 seconds a piece, but it just gives you some ideas so you can play around with it, not waste much clay, discard them if you don't like it, but it's just a sketch, and a three-dimensional sketch gives you a lot of good ideas. So that's the way I started, and it's been a fun project. I have templates for my projects. They don't need templates, but I did it first of all because it gives you an idea of what I'm going to do, and second of all because if you want to repeat something, it gives you an opportunity to do that. So this is just a simple rectangle, and it has two lines on it. It's got one on the top, one on the bottom. It goes in a third of the way each way, and a third of the way down, and a third of the way up. So I'm just going to cut a piece of clay. I like to cut clay from the bottom because I get a more even piece of clay than I do if I go from the top. The thickness of the clay is determined by how big a piece you want, and since it's a fairly small piece, it's going to need a fairly thin piece of clay. Okay, so I think I've got my piece of clay now. So I'm going to put some texture on this piece, but before I do, I'm going to take this kind of paint guide, which is my favorite tool, and just go over the surface so there won't be any texture on it that's residue if it had been on canvas or something else. It compresses the surface and doesn't detract from a texture. So I'm going to put the texture on here now. Roll that in. I wanted to roll so that the top of the lace is embedded into the clay so that you can see the texture as a nice sharp design. Then I'm going to take my template and put it over the design, which may be centered and it may not be centered. And I'm going to make a mark where the ends of those lines are so that I'll have it as a reference point, and I'm just sort of eyeballing it to be approximate. Okay. I'm going to take a piece of plastic to just soften the edges so that it's a little bit more finished looking, and they won't be sharp after firing. Then I'm going to take my toothbrush and water, and I'm going to just make a line here with the water and get it a little bit rough so that I can I'm going to overlap them like that, and overlap this one like that. Okay. Because this clay is rather wet, I'm going to have to put it inside of a form because normally it would hold its shape if it were just a little bit stiffer. So I'm just going to take a form that's sort of the shape to lift those edges up and give it an idea of what it wants to be. And if you want them to be raised more than that, you could just take a little of this plastic underneath it to create a little deeper tray or dish or whatever you want it to be, and kind of form it into any shape you'd like it to be. And it'll just be a tray. It could be a sushi dish. It could be whatever you choose to make it into. So there you go. So I'm going to roll my clay out, and I'm going to be cutting it into a triangle. As you can see, this is kind of square, not very triangular, but hopefully I'll get a triangle out of it about the size that I want it to be. want my clay to be a little bit thinner because the size of these pieces are fairly small and they don't need to have a whole bunch of weight to them. I like to flip it over so that it stretches out from all directions. So I have an equilateral triangle here, or approximately an equilateral triangle, and I'm going to cut around that with a needle tool. If I could find my needle tool, it's right here. I think almost every potter can tell you if they had an accumulation of all their needle tools from the time they started, it would be quite a big pile. Okay, so I have my triangle, and because this clay is wet, I just want to lift it up so it doesn't adhere to this table. And I'm also going to take a piece of plastic. Okay, now I'm going to cut in from the corners towards the middle, and I'm just eyeballing it. The further in I go, the taller the wall will be. It'll be more shallow if I don't go quite as far. So the further in I'm going to have a taller, smaller vessel. So I'm going to take these two together. Normally I'd use toothbrush and water, but because this clay is so soft, I don't even need to. And I'm just putting them together so that they are snuggled up against one another. Like that. And then I'm just going to turn them. I'm curling it around. You can go farther or you can go less far. And just sort of wind them up. And we'll do that with this one as well. And that just gives you a little dish that could be used for all kinds of things. I can wind it as much as I want to make it even smaller. That'll give me a little bit taller walls. Or you can just leave it the way it is. Bowls, and again, I have a template. This happens to be 7.5 by 7.5 inches. The reason being I happen to have some cardstock that was 7.5 by 7.5 inches. So I decided to go with it. Going with the flow is kind of how I live my life. So I'm just going to roll this out to be a little bit thinner, but size-wise it's moderately close to what I want it to be. This could have a texture on it, or it could just be without a texture. So I'm going to put my template on top of the clay and cut around it. And the two plates that I'm going to make now, they're both the same size, but they come out a little differently. So I've marked here where I have a hole here, and then I have one further in, but I'm going to do the shallower one right now. And that's it. Then I'm just going to draw my needle tool from that point to the edge, to the corner. This time I am going to use a little bit of toothbrush and water. I'm just going to overlap them a little bit, so the one that's overlapping is the one which is getting the water. And I'm just going to take the clay and overlap them. The further I overlap them, the higher the wall is going to be and the deeper the dish is going to be. And it gives you a fairly simple bowl, kind of Asian thematically, but there you go. Okay, so I have the same template. I'm going to put it on top of the clay, cut around it, make my square, and this one is going to be similar to the triangular one that I made, except square, which just indicates it could be any shape. It could be round, it could be, I'm going to make my dots at the further in point that I marked, and then draw a line to the corner. I'll use a little toothbrush and water so they'll connect together nicely. And I'm just going to push those together so the corners meet. Like that. So I could stop right there and just have a bowl like that, or I could do the same thing I did and just sort of twist these up so that they form more of a interesting shape. But you can do anything with them that you might want to do with them. And again, if you twist them up more, you'll end up with a taller wall. So if you had taken a round shape, you could do the same thing. You could do it in any shape you want. Just take your corners, put them together, and make your form. There's a little bit of clay that got on the rolling pin, so I don't want to roll with it, or it'll add a texture that I don't want. So I'm using one of those little green scrubbies to get it off. I can't wet it until I'm finished working with it, because otherwise it'll stick to the clay. But they do a good job of cleaning it up in the interim and trying not to breathe in the dust that it creates. Okay, so I'm going to start out with a template, the same 7.5-inch square that I've been using, as I say, just for no particular reason other than the fact that that's what I have, and it's a good size. The larger you make it, the more you have gravity to deal with, and it might take a little longer and require a little bit more effort. The smaller, it becomes much easier to control the clay. So I've cut my square, and now I'm going to cut these ribbons to the corner. Rather than a straight line, has a width to it. I'm not going to cut it off, I'm just going to leave it attached, but cut just to this point here. And this too, if I had cut in further, I would have a deeper bowl. If I cut in shallow, I'll have a less deep bowl. So I'm just going to now take this away, and I have my square with those cuts. I'm going to take a little piece of plastic just to, and I'm going to make sure this releases, which it does. I'm going to take a toothbrush and water and just wet and give a little bit of roughness to these ribbons that I cut. And I'm going to roll them up so that they roll towards the center, like that. And the fourth one. And this is going to be the bottom, and these essentially are going to be feet. I'm going to flip it over like that, and I'm going to take toothbrush and water on these edges here, because I'm going to overlap those. And just as before, if I overlap them significantly, it'll be a little deeper than if I do it shallow. And because there's a hole here, this is not going to be appropriate for holding anything liquid, but it'll be good for something for like a bread basket. In order to get this to dry in the shape I want it to be, I'm going to just turn it over like that to give it a little support system. And in a few minutes I will remove it, and you can see that it's formed kind of a nice bowl. Okay, so this is going to be a square, and I am going to put a texture on it, which is sort of a square texture. I guess that makes sense. And I'm going to roll this into it so that it leaves a deep impression. It's always nice to make a good impression. And I'm going to cut it out with my trusty 7.5 by 7.5 inch template, which I'm not sure if it's in the middle or it's not in the middle. But if it's not, it'll just make it more interesting. It'll be wabi-sabi. So I'm just going to cut that into a square. I'm going to mark these 4 points so that I could drag a line to the edges. Here. 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 It's very similar to other designs, except a little bit different because the cut's in a different place. So I'm going to lift these edges up so they're not stuck to the table. And actually I'll use a piece of plastic to soften the edges again. And now I will just overlap them. The further I overlap them, just like in the other shapes, the deeper the dish will be. So I'm going to do that. And the fourth one will be like that, which gives me a different kind of a shape. And you can embellish that and do something else with it if you like, or add some other elements, like to have a little button here to make it look sort of attached, and we can do that 4 times. And just take a little piece of clay, just make a little ball of it, wet it a little bit, and attach it. I'm pressing down against it, and that should be enough to hold it into place. And that will give me a ball. Okay, another template. This is also 7.5 by 7.5. Just for consistency, so I'm going to cut my square. I punched out a little hole as a reference point in from each corner, and I'm going to go from there to a line here, a line here, a line here. And you know, you could just do this arbitrarily by eyeballing it. There's no need to have a template at all or anything so specific. But what I'm going to do is make a line going this way. I can eyeball it, or I could actually use a ruler, but being me, I'm going to just eyeball it and just go like that. And let's see, I have one going this way. And the fourth one will be like that. I'm going to lift it a little bit so it's not stuck to the table. I'm going to put a texture in the middle, like that, and approximate where the middle is. And in order to get that down, I'm going to use a pony roller, because this tapered roller is going to press a little harder in order to get it to sink into the clay a little better. I think this slab is slightly thicker so it can incorporate this texture into it easier. I'm going to take another texture to put on top of that. Something like that, just as an arbitrary texture. give it some other interest. I want the texture to come all the way up to the rubber in the middle so that there won't be a gap there. And then when I pull it away, hopefully, it's going to make sense. So I'll take that away, and I'll remove my center texture here, like that. And now I will overlap them. So these sides are going to be lifted. Let me release them so they're not stuck to the table. Okay. So this is going to go over like this. So I'm going to put toothbrush and water along this edge here so that I can move that this way and do that on all four sides. And because this clay is soft, I will need to put it inside of a form to hold the shape until the clay dries a little bit and can support itself. So I'm going to take a bowl, something like this. Because this is porous, it's a bisque bowl, it doesn't need any plastic in there. If it was made out of metal or plastic or glass, I would need to put a liner in it of plastic or something to keep it from sticking. But right now I'm just going to put it in like this so that it'll take the shape as it dries, and that'll be a bowl. I've rolled out a slab of clay, and I've intentionally made it fairly thin because I want this to drape nicely, and to drape nicely it requires a thin slab. So I also want it to be kind of circular, but not necessarily a perfect circle. It could be something that has more grace to it, perhaps something a little bit more scalloped perhaps, or it really doesn't matter, but having a shape to it will just make it a little bit more graceful. So I'm going to take a piece of plastic and I'm going to just refine that edge a little bit, because once it's on the bowl and it's not flat anymore, I won't have an opportunity to do that anymore. So I'm going to turn it over so I can do both sides. Stick as much as it does, that would be better. And refine this edge as well. Then I'm going to leave it on top of this plastic. So I'm going to flip it over again. And I'm going to just take a small round, this happens to be a paint can, try to find the middle of it if I can. Something like that. Even if it's not in the middle, it's okay. And allow it to drape down. Then I'm going to put folds in it. And the more folds that I put into it, the more graceful it's going to look. And it's going to have kind of a windswept look to it. So I keep trying to reduce those folds and make them smaller and smaller and smaller. And you can keep going until you're happy with it, and whenever that is, that's when you stop. But I could stop right now, or I could still put a few more in and just divide that up. The more you divide it, the more interesting it gets. And so here I can take this one and fold that into two, and make another one here, so that it forms these very tight little pleats. Now that I have my bowl put together, I need to remove it, because if it shrinks down, it's going to form a crack here because it's on a rigid surface. So what I'm going to do is put it in a bowl, and I'm going to put another piece of plastic over it, just basically to cushion it a little bit, and then put it with a bowl over it, invert the whole thing into it, and then remove the can so that I have a bowl that's being supported by this other bowl until it dries a little bit. And I will have a very organic and very graceful bowl. It'll take on that exact shape when it's dry. So this is going to be actually a 3-minute vase, not a 5-minute vase. We need to have a straight line someplace because that's where it's going to sit on a table, and the table is going to be flat, presumably. But all the other angles or lines on it could be just about anything you want. So I'm just going to cut an edge here, and then I'm going to taper this down a little bit so it's more of a arbitrary triangle. This will be my base, and I'm going to just cut a little bit more off here. And what I need to do is I'm going to just smooth those edges a little bit. I'll put a little bit of texture on it just so that it has something interesting. So just press down a little bit more on it. Okay. And now I'm going to flip it over because this is going to be the top side. Again, my clay is quite wet. So I'm going to flip it this way. I'm going to take some newspaper and roll it up. And then I'm just going to roll it around this way. I'm going to roll it around this, making it into a cylinder, and that is my vase. Now, in order to take the paper out, I have to twist it a little bit tighter so that I can pull it out. And I have a vase. I can push these out so that it becomes a little bit more graceful and get more of a kind of a petal kind of a look to it. And then I need to put a base on it, of course. So one thing I can do is to just put this on a base, cut around it so that it's exactly that size. I could make it more of a triangle or a different geometric shape so that it'll form that. Or I can just take it and kind of arbitrarily make it a lot bigger and not measure it or anything, heaven forbid. And then just pick up these sides and let them form another element of just being something a little organic and give it a little bit more interest. And so that would be a vase. That takes about 3 minutes. That's another fast vase. I did make a template. I made it as 2 profiles of people, female, male, and they are going to overlap each other like that so that you see both faces on the same side. Easily it could have been just wrapped like that without having faces or anything else on it. You could pierce it or do something totally different. But in this case, I'm going to use my trusty template and just cut around it. I will cut out the eyes just because it'll add some interest. So I'll discard this clay. Okay, I'm going to turn this over. I'm going to take my newspaper again, roll it up, and see, I got to go this way. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to use toothbrush and water because these have to connect together. So I'm going to put it at the edges where they come together so they will adhere to one another. You could go in a few inches or more depending what you want. And I'm going to use this newspaper just to keep them separated from each other. Put them together. I'm going to stand it up now so you can see I'm attaching them together where the profiles are not coordinated exactly intentionally. I'm going to pull out this newspaper, which was there just in order to get it to stand up. They both stick together. There we go. And we do need a base for it, so I can just take a piece of clay, hopefully like that, and make a base for it. So I'm going to just use a little toothbrush and water. where I think the base is going to go. And I'm going to put some on the base here. And you can refine the shape and make it come out or in as much as you want. And take the needle tool, just cut around the base so that it forms a seamless kind of look. And then just smooth that out and smooth out the top a little bit. But it's a quick vase, and the shape could be anything you might want it to be. Doesn't have to be two figures, and you can have it come out more or be more slender, just depending on what appeals to you. You could also bend this a little bit if you wanted to. So, I have a template. This is 5 by 10 inches. The proportions will get me a cup that's something like that. If you wanted it taller, obviously you could make it higher this way, or wider would make it longer. So you can just determine whatever size you want it to be. But this is what I'm going to start out with, is a 5 by 10 inch rectangle. And from this, I will have a cup that is made both the sides and the bottom all in one slab. So this is my rectangle here, and I'm going to be standing it up as a cylinder. So I'm going to take toothbrush and water. Actually, I think I'll just taper those edges just a little bit so that the overlap won't be too cumbersome. Some water here, and do it on the opposite side here, and let those overlap each other. They're overlapping perhaps a ½ inch, and standing that up so that I have pretty much just a cylinder. So I'm determining which side is going to be the lip, and I think it'll be this one here. So this will be my bottom. So what I'm going to do is make it pretty much like a bow tie. I'm going to take my toothbrush and water and just go on the interior of that, so that when the pieces come together, they will tend to want to stay together. And I'm going to just pinch it so that join is going to join the opposite side, and I'm going to end up with the center part connected. And then these two sides I'm going to push in to form that bow tie. And I'm going to keep going, so I'm going to pinch these together like this and overlap them. Let it fold in like that, and then pinch it some more to form like a two-footed base. And I'm going to flip it over, and now I'm going to take a wooden spoon. It could be any rounded form. I'm going to put it in water, and I'm going to just stretch it out a little bit from the inside to give it a little more volume and make it a little bit more interesting. If you wanted it a perfect rectangle, you wouldn't need to do that. But if you want to give it any kind of a more bulbous shape, this will kind of work to do that. And you can keep going and making it more and more and more. So you want this edge to be nice and smooth, because when you're drinking out of a cup, you want the edge to be something that feels good and not going to cut a lip. And if you wanted to flare it out a little bit, you could take a little moisture on your finger and stretch it a little bit, so that you would end up with a little bit more grace to the form. But it's all a matter of what you'd like. But essentially, that is the form. So I am going to maybe taper my edges a little bit. And do the same thing by taking a toothbrush and water on the edges that are going to connect together. one on the inside and the other on the outside, and overlap them. Probably about a ½ inch. Stand it up so it forms a cylinder. And I like this side better than this side, so I'm going to use that as the lip because that's the one that's going to show the most. So what I'm going to do now is take my cylinder, or almost cylinder, and I'm going to try to form it into a square using the overlap as a center line on one side and trying to go across it and try to make it into a square so that all four sides are exactly the same. If they aren't, you may end up with the bottom not being symmetrical, which sometimes isn't a tragedy, but it would be hard to drink out of. So now I have my square. I'm going to take toothbrush and water so these connect together. And I'm going to do the same thing and pinch from the sides. But now I have four sides coming together instead of two. And I'm going to keep pinching and pinching and pinching until I make contact in the middle. And as you can see, when you go in, it forms feet here, and the center is going to collapse a little bit so it's lower down. So at this point, I'm going to take a little moisture to make those feet a little bit more refined. And then, because I'm going to have a little hole here, I'm going to have to take a little piece of clay. And you could make a ball of clay, you could make a little flat slab, you can put your initials on it, make it decorative, you could make it anything you'd like it to be. And we're going to put that there just to make like a button so that it'll keep whatever liquid you have in there from falling out. Like that. And if you wanted to, you could make feet for it so that it would stand a little taller by putting those on, but I'm not going to do that right now. And I'm going to just flip this over. I'm going to do the same thing to give it a little bit more shape and volume by going out. And you can do this continuously over and over again with a little moisture to make it quite round, or you can stop and not do it at all, your choice. And when you're finished with it, I want to refine the top because again, that's the lip you're going to drink out of, and you want that to be smooth and not dangerous. And one other thing you might want to do to it, if you take something that's tapered, it could be a funnel or any tapered shape, and nestle it just gently inside of it, it's going to bring it back to a true round. So if it's gotten misshapen in that way when you're finished with it, that could be the last thing you do, so that you end up with a vessel that has a round top on it, which makes it a lot easier to drink out of. This one I'm going to treat differently, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this top part off. I'm going to go down approximately a third of the way. I haven't measured it, but I'm assuming it's about a third, and we're going to measure about the same here. That way, no matter where I make my lines, they're going to end up pretty much in the same place. And I'm just going to cut it like something like that. And then I'm going to retain this piece, which will be the top, and this will be the bottom. And I'm going to put a texture on the bottom part of it. I'll try this. And roll that onto it to give it some interest. Pull that off. Actually, this didn't show much, so I'm just going to fake it down here and make it textured. Nobody's going to know the difference. So I have, this is my bottom part and my top part. It's stretched a little bit, not that much. I'll just push it in a little bit. So now I'm going to just soften those edges. I'm just using a little water on my finger. I could use a piece of plastic just as easily. Just soften those edges and make them a little bit more rounded. This one in particular, because this is going to overlap the other and it's going to look more like a drip. I'm going to just wet this here because the other one is going to lay on top of this one. Matter of fact, I think I'll do that on the inside of this too. And lay this on top of it. So they overlap just a tiny little bit. going to press it down so that they connect together quite well. And I'm going to trim this a little bit, just if I had a needle tool, so that it's even. And now I'm going to do the same as I did with the others, attach it and make it into a cylinder. So I'm going to just take my toothbrush and water on one side and on the opposite side of the other end, put them together. So I'm just attaching it together, overlapping it a little under ½ an inch, and that'll give me a cylinder. And in this case, I don't have to decide which is the top and bottom. This will definitely be the top. So I'm going to turn it over, and this time, instead of having 2 or 4 legs, I'm going to end up with 3 legs. So I'm going to take my toothbrush and water again on the inside so that when they connect together, they'll stay together. And I'm going to form a triangle this time, where I have the center of one side will be the seam, and I'm going to try and make them equilateral so that it'll stand up straight, and then pinch those sides together, starting at the 3 corners and working my way towards the middle. So it will have 3 legs. Again, the center part is going to have a little bit of a hole in it, so I'm making a little button to go into that hole so that nothing's going to leak out. And it could be whatever design you wanted it to be. Just going to put that down there for now. And you could put feet on it, or you could just leave it alone. And then I'm going to flip that over so that I end up with a vessel that's a little different from the other 2. Again, I'm going to try and give it a little bit more volume because I just think it's a little more attractive that way, but it's not required. It's just up to you. And you can work it. You can make the lip come out a little bit more. You want to refine that lip and make it nice and smooth. And I'm going to do the same thing on this one. Put this in here just to bring it back to round. And there is a different. I'm going to make a cup and saucer, and my template that I'm going to use is this 5-petaled sort of lotus shape. So I'm going to make 2 of these. One of them is going to be the cup, and the other one is going to be the saucer. Okay, that would be one, and the other one is going to go here. This slab is fairly thin because for this particular shape, it really doesn't require much thickness, and it looks a little more graceful if it's thin rather than chunky. So the one that's going to be the saucer, I'm going to just leave as it is. I'm not going to do anything more to it except shape it. Whereas the one that's going to be the cup is going to get shaped. So in both cases, I'm going to take a little piece of plastic and just refine the edges so that they are softer and more attractive. And just arbitrarily, I'm going to use this one. Well, I'm going to use this for the cup because this is a little thicker. So what I'm going to do is cut into it. So I can cut in just a tiny little bit, or I can cut in far. The further I cut in, the taller and narrower the cup is going to be. If I go in very shallow or barely anything at all, it's going to be more of a bowl or dish shape. So I'm going to cut into it fairly significantly because I want it to be tall and I want it to be fairly narrow. So I'm cutting in, and this may not be even quite enough. I may just go a tiny little bit further than that. And I'm going to take a toothbrush and water because I'm going to overlap them, and I want to make sure that they stick together when the clay dries. And I'm going to overlap them. The more I overlap it, the straighter the sides are going to be. If I overlap them just a little, it's going to flare out a lot more. So I'm going sort of medium. And this is giving me my cup. To make it a little bit more graceful, I'm going to just use my finger here to kind of shape these petals so they have a little more flair to them. And that will give me a cup. This into a rounded shape. I'm going to take a tennis ball, or it could be anything round, and I'm going to just try to give it a memory of being kind of round, stretching the clay a little bit so that it forms a little bit more of a shape. And then I can flatten out the middle and have the sides go down as much as I want them to go. And then put my cup on there, and I have a cup and saucer. So these are just a few of the things that you could make in 5 minutes or less. It's limitless. This is what you can think up to do, and it's a fun thing to do. So if you have just a few minutes to do it, it's a time to be creative and enjoy. I hope that you've enjoyed this.